Good evening, and welcome to everyone here and everyone at home. We know this is going to be a wonderful series, and we're welcoming all of you. I'm supposed to be introducing Jim Perkinson and Lily Mendoza. My acquaintance with Jim goes back to the 1970s, when he was a member of the Church of Messiah on the east side of Detroit. He identifies himself as a settler on the Three Fires land, that section of Detroit which was the home of indigenous people who lived there hundreds of years ago, before the Europeans arrived. Jim has his doctorate from the University of Chicago, and he is now a professor of social ethics at the Ecumenical Theological Seminary. He also teaches intercultural communication at Oakland University and has authored 5 books so far. They're all laying out on the table here. And he also teaches intercultural communication at Oakland. I already said that, didn't I? He describes himself as an artist of the spoken word poetry scene and an activist in the struggle against water shutoffs. Dr. Lily Mendoza is a professor of culture and communication at Oakland University. She can speak with authority about being on the receiving end of Western Christian arrogance. As a person who values and hands-on her own indigenous culture, she will give us a rare inside look into the damage that Western Christians have done since the 16th century in the Philippines and around the world. Let's welcome them, shall we? Applause, please. So, Jim will begin. Rewind, they'll both begin.
Thank you, Sister Angela. Actually, tonight is Jim's gig, and thank you. And we were thinking that tonight we will do brief introductions, but thank you for the initial introduction from Sister Angela. Before anything else, I just wanted to commend the Jesu beloved community. As an overhearer of a lot of your online communications, I've just been so impressed at your commitment and dedication to ever grow in your understanding of the critical issues of today. So it's really an honor for us to be here with you and to be learning with you. So I will be doing a more extensive introduction later on, but what really looms large in my personal story is the colonial history that sits between the United States and my homeland, the Philippines. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that history, but the Philippines is actually known as the only formal colony of the United States. Typically, you don't hear of the U.S. as having been a colonial power. It only used to admit to a diplomatic history. But at the turn of the 20th century, when it was looking around and seeing all of the other powers take over colonies, we were actually referred to as the Philippine Temptation, because it was at that moment when the U.S. saw an opportunity with the Filipino people having just fought a war of independence and nearly successfully ended 350 years of Spanish rule. Then the U.S. saw an opportunity. When you have an area that's not already taken by a colonial power, that is considered like a vacant power vacuum. And so the U.S. invaded us at the point when we had just declared our independence from Spain in 1898. And in the process, massacred about 500 to a million. What is it? No, half a million to a million Filipinos. And that colonial project is really about civilizing what they call a savage people, right? The goal was really to civilize and to Christianize us. And I wanted to share just this pronouncement from President McKinley when he was asked by a Methodist delegation as to his justification for forcibly taking over the Philippines. He said, I would like to say just a word about the Philippine business. I have been criticized a good deal about the Philippines, but don't deserve it. The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines, and when they came to us as a gift from the gods, I did not know what to do with them. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night, late, it came to me this way, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. That we could not turn them over to France and Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. And that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and Christianize them. And by God's grace, do the very best we could by them. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. And the next morning, I sent for the chief engineer of the War Department, and I told him to put the Philippines on the map of the United States. And there they are, and they will stay while I am president. So civilization and Christianization were two projects meant to strip us of our barbarism that not even 350 years of Spanish rule were able to accomplish, at least not fully. And for more than half of my life, fully internalized, my path has been to strive to become a dutiful subject of empire, fully internalizing its tenets, except for two things that stubbornly refuse to capitulate, which has nothing to do with any rational willing on my part. One of them is the rebellion of my tongue against the imposition of the English language. It became our official medium of instruction, and we were punished. We were fined 5 centavos apiece for every infraction, even during recess time. And it was like having my tongue cut off. There's no reason why I couldn't or wouldn't speak it, right? But somehow it was very painful for me growing up, having had to be forcibly asked to speak English. And it was only later that I began to understand that was my body's way of resisting colonization. And the other is my body's love for colors. This is not representative of it today. But actually, I learned. I remember coming here to the US the very first time. A sister of mine who has been here much longer would say to me, "You look like a leprechaun. I don't know you because you're supposed to dress in this, subdued earth colors." But I couldn't give up my love for color. And I learned from a noted anthropologist, Michael Tausig, that the wild colors, brilliant colors, are actually indicative of the undomesticated self. And he said, men and women in a state of nature, uncivilized nations and children have a great fondness for colors in their utmost brightness. The same applied to uneducated people and Southern Europeans, especially the women with their bright-colored bodices and ribbons. On the other hand, as Goethe notes, people of refinement had a disinclination to colors, women wearing white, the men black, and not only in dress. When it came to what Goethe called pathological colors, people of refinement avoid vivid colors in the objects around them and seem inclined to banish vivid colors from their presence altogether. And so these two bodily resistance to colonization, I would call my salvation, right? My tongue and my body's resistance to the civilizing norm. And they serve as now my gateway to my journey toward decolonization and recovery of my indigenous soul that I will be speaking more about later on. Thank you.
So ditto what my baby was saying about Jesu and particularly beloved community, as you all have managed to keep going through thick and thin over the years we first encountered you. It's been amazing to watch everybody so doggedly persistent, except for Charlie. I don't know about Charlie. I mean, it's so hard to be in this environment where everybody's masked and I can't tell whether you're laughing or scowling. And but thank you, Charlie. Am I centered right for you? Because I'm going to try to stick with some of the slides that we're going to put up here. And obviously you have already encountered the title of the presentation. These are some of the books that are up on the front table. And as Lily Mendoza, I never know what to call her in these kinds of situations because I just call her Babe, and yet formally I should be saying Dr. Mendoza. Just doesn't come off my tongue very easily. But Dr. Mendoza was saying about her journey. Likewise for me, everything that I bring to bear in this kind of situation or might have to say comes out of my own personal journey. I don't think I have credibility except for those things I have attempted to walk and live, at least to a degree. And for me, that looks roughly like this, where I came to Detroit as an evangelical, thinking I was on mission to help poor people in the inner city deal with their reality, and it took 8 years to get disabused of that on the part of an inner city east side neighborhood of Detroit, low income, African American, and finally get so I could see the amazing survival skills, the creativity, the percussive mentality that was constantly pushing back on an impossible circumstance and making it yield beauty in spite of itself with minimal resources. But once I got to I could see that, then I realized I'm not here to help anybody do anything, but to learn about white skin and how it operates historically in this country, to learn about Detroit, to learn about this bigger thing called the United States of America from a place very different than I grew up with. So having to face white supremacy in myself in ways I had inherited the ecology of the country, been schooled and shaped by it, and even though making a commitment to push back on it for the rest of my life, still at any point subject to tripping up and once again falling into channeling it. So that's an ongoing initiation, right, and schooling coming from black anger and black humor and black creativity that has been my way into a lot of the kind of things we're going to be talking about over the next 4 weeks. Then hooking up with this wonderful woman from the Philippines, herself dealing with U.S.-Philippines colonial relationships about which I knew nothing when I met her and had to get up to speed very quickly and learn about a whole nother aspect of U.S. Involvement that doesn't get talked about in our school system, in our families, or in our public discourse with one another, but which is a brutal, violent history alongside the history of enslavement and the history of settler colonialism. Sort of the next layer down for me, learning about the peoples of Detroit that were here before white folk came here from Europe and then pulled African folk over, ripped out of the mother continent to disappear native people to the degree they could genocidally, to take the land and then have it labored for them by enslaved bodies, yielding wealth for people that look like me. And that's a whole nother history and set of relationships to come to grips with. Native folks still around. In the metro Detroit area, about 30,000, but we typically don't see them. They're not highly visible unless we start to pay attention. And that's what I'm all about doing with my baby, to learn from folk who used to know how to live here without having to progress elsewhere. I'll say more about that in a minute. And then finally, underneath all of that, recovering relationship with non-human reality, with the rest of the biosphere, the plants, the animals, the waters, the fire, the seasons, the soils, that are constitutive of us, but which for we have increasingly marginalized in our understanding, raped, pillaged, and plundered in our activity. So all that I am saying is coming out of my own struggle to learn from those different layers within me and around me, many of which are covered up. This is the outline of what we'll be doing, and for tonight, the big question for me that I want to try to speak somewhat to, or at least provide a frame for, is the question the climate is posing to us, which at one level is a matter of water speak, water shouting at us in floods and hurricanes and sea level rise, or going aloof and withheld in drought and then wildfires such as we see in California or last year in Australia, ongoing in the Amazon basin and now in the Arctic. And because part of what we're doing is to learn from indigenous folks, learn about the history of and enslavement, and then go back to the Christian tradition, and particularly the biblical tradition, I wanted to get this out up front, and then we'll your session. Mark, verse 1 of chapter 1 says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus, and then goes on like you see laid out there, which is to say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, not Jesus, according to Mark and according to the other gospelers. It in fact is a messenger and angelic-like power that shows up as a voice in the wilderness, a voice arising out of the wilderness. And I'm going to use wilderness and the word wild in a recognize it's a beleaguered term, a term in the English language used by settler colonial people to imagine tracts of land devoid of native presence. That is to say, it's been part of the colonizing discourse. But I want to be able to talk some way or another about reality before and outside of us as a species. The planet was made for us. We are latecomers on the scene. We're probably the youngest species on the planet. All the other life forms are our elders. And indigenous peoples knew how to honor that, learn from that, learn survival skills in local ecologies until we made a choice, which I'm going to talk about for the rest of tonight, about 5,000 years ago, to begin to separate ourselves from that in the conceit that our species is the supreme species and everything else is there for us just to use up, abuse, disappear, cut apart, resplice together, whatever way we damn well please. And to unlearn that is a major thing. So I'm going to use the terms wilderness and wild, even though they're beleaguered. If I had better terms, I would use them, but there has to be some way to talk about reality outside of us. It recognizes its own rights, its beauty, its dignity, its particularity, its mystery, its spirituality, and its personhood. The biblical tradition majors in wilderness as the primary place of revelation, the primary place of initiation, the primary place of schooling, of nurture when you by your social order, and of the incubation of resistance movements, prophetic movements, to try to challenge the powers that be and open up greater space for justice and sustainability. And I just wanted up front to get that out so you're aware that that's there. John the Baptist appears in the wilderness. Countryside goes out to him, so does the city, go into the wild river, and are being schooled by a man who himself has been reprogrammed by going east of the Jordan to consort with Bedouin pastoral nomads, learn how to live off the land from them, and even dress in the ways they dress, making use of the materials that are available from wild nature out there. And then Jesus himself, when he shows up finally, will not pretend to be able to speak to his reality out of his own upbringing, but to have to go outside of society, go back into the wild, through the river, have a dove that incarnates the spirit land on his shoulder, drive him into the wilderness as tutor, shaman, sponsor, and then be schooled by what happens out there and incubate or hatch his own vision that he brings back into society. More about that, probably the third session we are together. Where are we today? We are in a society in which technological innovation is going at hyper speed out away from our ability to understand and how to relate to it. We're in a new moment with social media, and over the last 20 years in particular, with the way that has been hooked up with algorithms, so that now our private experience, every choice we make, not just every keystroke, but if you have an iPhone and you're walking in the park, it's paying attention to the pace at which you're walking. And if you're talking, the volume and tonality of your voice, all of that is being to corporations that have a profile set up of you that knows you better than you know yourself, because they can keep tabs on every single thing that you are doing that shows up on social media. And then running it back at you in a behavior modification program that Shoshana Zuboff, who writes a book called Surveillance Capitalism, says is the largest such behavior modification program we've ever seen in our species' history on the planet. And it selects for the deepest, most immediate, most visceral emotional response. So fake news that is aimed at galvanizing outrage gets 6 times the play that factual news gets. And we see the results of it all around us, and we're headed into the results this election. We no longer know how to have discourse with each other because we're just operating out of emotion in our respective silos and can't make time to assess much of anything other than the latest outrage we perceive that has been fed to us. I'm deeply terrified by that. And the more I learn about it, the more I think it's a huge dystopia that we are fast heading into. I'd encourage you, if you have a Netflix account, Even to critique, I have to rely on the thing I'm critiquing. To watch The Social Dilemma, Unplug and Run, by Silicon Valley insiders who are talking about what's actually happened. This technological development is different than anything we've ever had before. There's nothing in a bicycle when a bicycle was invented that wants to keep you on the bicycle. There's nothing in a book after the printing press was invented that is working to hold you in the text of the book, holding on to the book. But with this computer, with your iPhone, with social media, the best brains on the planet are involved figuring out how to hook up with your biochemistry, particularly your dopamine hits in your brain, to make sure you find it more and more difficult to walk away. It is a drug, and it is highly effective. And so that's our present, and it is part and parcel of a whole new game of watching, of surveilling everything we're doing, which gets marketed to corporations that make money off of it, but also gets used by the state to keep control and potentially repress dissent. We'll come back to that later tonight. We also are in a time where obviously Black Lives Matter has come out in organizing large segments of white population for a moment. We'll see whether white people actually are changing. But pulling up the last 400 years of history of this country and showing to what degree it has never been faced and never been dealt with. A movement that, among other things, I think is an ongoing public liturgy about the unsolved trauma of enslavement and race in this history. Underneath that, we have Standing Rock, just a couple of years back, Native American folk working to protect water, even though it got talked about in the news as protest, where they are trying to push back on the corporatization and commodification of fossil fuel, running it recklessly through land where it potentially would destroy watersheds and the Missouri River. Pulling up an even older past, going back to Columbus. And then COVID-19 as a messenger of the last 7 months, hopping over from the bat community and basically, I think, serving as a sign saying, look, you all, you've got to stop. You're taking up everything. You're destroying all habitat. You're encroaching on every other life form. There is going to be blowback. Learn to live with the rest of the biosphere, or you will be taken out. You think you've got it all under control. Something you can't see, that we do not even know how to classify as living or non-living, is able to take down the entire global economy. And we are intimate with viruses. The estimate is that I have some 380 trillion of those little creatures riding in my body right now, and so do you. They are also our ancestors, and probably are the ones who were the creators of diversity, working to exchange DNA so that the biosphere is constantly creating more and more diversity, which is necessary to have any one species flourish. So at blush, COVID-19, I would suggest, is not a problem to be solved, not a disease to be fought. This is not a war. This is about the living tissue of the planet that we are part of. Yes, COVID gets taken up in our social systems and weaponized and targeted at black and brown bodies in particular, and global south bodies and poor bodies. But that's a result of our social system, not of the biosphere itself. And then climate crisis, which I think COVID-19 is part of, writ large, fires in California, the sea level rise, what I already mentioned, which I think for years now has been saying to us as a form of communication the same thing COVID-19 is basically saying, which is full halt. What are you doing here? What is a human being? And Lily and I is the big question. Oh, there we go. This is the cover of the new book, which is a Sturgeon by William Luca, an African-American artist, amazing, creative character on the scene, but depicting Detroit, in which it is the river manifesting as a huge fish that was integral to Native American culture for thousands of years, a fish that had been around for close to 2 million years, that emerges as this great magnificent beast with the city itself reduced and put in the background, which I adopted as sort of the image under which I wrote the book, out of which much of this workshop is coming, as one figure of climate change speaking to us. And of course, we've got hurricanes, we've got the fires that I already mentioned. I'm wanting to understand climate crisis as communication, as a problem, as a communication to be heard before it's a problem to be solved, as water speak, as I've already mentioned. And the question it poses, at least for the two of us, is what does it mean to be a human? Up inside that question is, are we hardwired to destroy ourselves in the places that we live? Are we just a self-destructive species? Or have we at times in the past lived without destroying where we live and without destroying each other? And the big question for me then is, can I live right where I am without having to go elsewhere, enslave other people, plunder other places to support my lifestyle? That is to say, if all the electricity went out tomorrow and I had to start to live right here for my food, my shelter, my clothing, my community, do I have that kind of relationship with the plants, the animals, the soils, the seasons, the waters, that I could do that day in, day out, over a lifetime, have kids that themselves could do that generation after generation? The answer is no, I don't know how to do that. I'm dependent on an armature, an industrial armature that plunders other folk for the sake of my lifestyle, whether I like it or not. I'm trying to recover some of those skills, so is Lily. So are a number of other people. Of you here in this crowd are. But I think that's the deep question anymore. If we're going to really face what we've unleashed on the planet in the way of destruction, sort of at the heart of it is, can I live otherwise than destructively? Can I live right here? You know, indigenous folk in Australia lived in some of the harshest terrain for more than 55,000 years. Didn't have to go elsewhere, didn't have to import anything, didn't have to take over anybody else. Pomo Indians in Northern California doing the same thing for 11,000 years. Folk in the Great Lakes Basin doing it for thousands of years. Can we? And in that question is another question, which is, what is the appropriate unit by which to think about what a human being is? We live in a society that says we're primarily individuals, and that my identity stops at the edges of my body. Even though, if I actually lived just within my body, I would die in a very short time. I need air, I need water, I need food, and I need some place for all of that to go when it comes out the other end once I've used it as something that is compost to me, but life to another life form. I'm not just an individual. In fact, I am a much bigger self embedded in a local ecology. Indigenous folk would say the right unit to think about being a human being is probably the unit determined by water, the watershed. Water is what organizes biodiversity in local eco-regions or bioregions all over the planet. Water's the great arbiter of life. And it doesn't move in a straight line. It doesn't create nation states. It creates watersheds where within that particular region of water, all the life forms are symbiotically interrelated with each other. And that's part of what I think we need to recover. What I'm talking about in all of this, then, are two things. For the big questions I'm wrestling with out of all that I see going on, and all the history of settler colonialism and enslavement, and rape, pillage, and plunder. Those two questions are, how can I relate justly to other members of my species? Question of justice. And secondly, and equally important, but even bigger and older, how can we relate to non-human creatures in a way that's sustainable and reciprocal, generation after generation? Those are the two things I'm interested in asking at the deepest levels about everything we're doing. Those are the two questions that have been called in question for me by everything that we're doing. Everybody with me so far, roughly, in what I'm laying out? Okay. What has been sustainable and what has been unsustainable in our history as a species? For the last 5,000 years, we've launched this thing called civilization. I have it in quotes because I don't think it's civilized. I think it has been profoundly destructive. There have been 200 plus imperial civilizations over the last 5,000 years, every one of which has destroyed its resource base, fractured into civil war, had to go elsewhere and conquer other people, or disappeared, or some combination of those things. The career of this thing called civilization on the planet is that it doesn't work, at least from an evolutionary point of view. From an evolutionary point of view, 5,000 years is the blink of an eye. It's not a long time. It's an untested way for our species to live. So far, the returns on it are not good. And now, we are looking at the real possibility that we will take ourselves out of existence if we don't redo our understanding of what we think civilization is. Before 5,000 years ago, virtually every place and way we lived on the planet was roughly sustainable in what we dismiss as pre-civilization and pre-history. We've done a huge disinformation campaign on our own ancestry, dismissed it as irrelevant, vaunted ourselves as superior to everything our people knew about how to live on the land back there. And now we're in deep doo. So for the rest of tonight, I want to major on talking about that frame. Because I think, I'm involved in the water struggle in Detroit, which is an immediate emergency, has been for a long period of time, going back certainly into the 90s, but with the imposition of emergency management starting in 2012, really ramped up and targeting especially poor black and brown households. And so under the leadership of older African American women and younger hip-hop heads and all kinds of other folk, a number of us got involved, pushing back, demonstrating, writing articles, trying to educate, doing nonviolent civil disobedience. And that's crucial. To respond to the immediate needs, I think, is part of our responsibility. But alongside that immediate concern, I think we also have to be asking the bigger picture. What is it we're really trying to do now? What are we aiming at? Do we want only to open up a little bit of the stolen goods pie to a few other folk that haven't had access to it? So, instead of the 1%, it would be the 2% that gets to live luxuriously at the expense of everybody else. Is that what we're aiming at? What are we aiming at? What is our vision for what it means to live justly and sustainably? So I'm about walking on two different legs, a leg that is constantly responding to the immediate political emergency of the moment, and the other leg constantly asking about what's happening with this big picture of our history and our time on the planet. How do we work towards something that's sustainable, something that's just, where we learn from the folk who knew how to do that back in our past? So this is my graphic of our time on the planet, particularly the last 5,000 years. And I want to walk you through it. It's a little mental snapshot I developed to help me think about complex social reality, so I don't get lost in the trees and miss a sense of what a forest is, because all the details, all the particular trees have me disoriented. Which is how I think most of us deal with complex reality. To distill a little snapshot, a simplifying caricature that helps us see what's going on. But once I do that, I have to remember the map in my head is not the same as the territory it's helping me see. And I have to take the map, the image out, and test it against the complexity. Refine it, pull it back in, use it to see into that complexity, take it back out, test it against that complexity, refine it, pull it back in. I live in that process constantly. This is my little mental map, again, for our species' social history on the planet. And you'll note, I've got to get used to using this thing here. This is a major threshold. And what I'm going to relate to you now, there's a lot of literature on it. I can make you aware of what those books and what that scholarship is. James Scott, political scientist, anthropologist from Yale, is a particular person who's helped me understand this broad-based picture of the history. But this threshold that we crossed is the moment where we began to first form city-state systems to do monocrop agriculture based on generating surplus product. And that first happened, as best we are aware, about 3,200 BCE, give or take a few hundred years, in Mesopotamia, between potable water, in between two drinkable sources, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then other places around the planet, China, later on in Mesoamerica, in ultimately Europe, the same thing took place. And it's this changeover from what we were doing before to what we've been doing after that I want to spend some time talking about. Before that, for most of our history on the planet, we lived as what are called hunting and gathering communities, hunter-gatherer folk, who were around, depending upon what you consider a human being to be, anywhere from 200,000 to 3 million years. If you consider Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Australopithecine to be part of what a human being is, what our species is, then we've been around for about 3 million years. If you consider only to be the real human being, then it's 200,000 years. But in any case, it's overwhelmingly more than 95% of our time on the planet. We live this way, mobile, in place, in a local ecosystem, and living in band societies of 150 people or less, and not doing agriculture, not re-engineering the place we lived. Because we knew the plants, we knew the animals, we knew the seasonal cycles, we knew what was going to fruit when, we knew when there would be lightning strikes and wildfires that would attract new growth, that would attract kinds of animals that we could then hunt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that worked all over the planet, most places. The evidence on hunter-gatherer societies is that they had their work function down to about 3 to 5 hours per day. And it wasn't even work like we consider it to be work. It was, in most places, the women going out to gather berries and dig up roots, and the men going out to hunt big game. A few places where it was inverted, where the women hunted and the men gathered. But for each of those two groups, you know, it was gossip time. It was catching up on, you know, who's now getting attracted to whom, who's having a baby, who's getting senile, who's, you had social time. It was fun. You joked around, but you also gathered your food. What'd you do the rest of the time? You napped. You played with the kids. You did ritual. You did art. You made meaning. And you didn't hoard. There was no impetus to hoard because it's like you're living in a great big food pantry. What's there today will be there tomorrow and the next day and the next day. You know the properties of all of those things, their characteristics. There's no sense in hoarding anything because you just go out and cook dinner. Right? Many hunting and gathering groups, at least in the evidence that we have, never went to war. Don't even have words for war and take and plunder, or in some cases even words for things like worry or need. They lived a fairly freewheeling, relaxed, eating broadly across an ecosystem lifestyle. And relaxed in their child-rearing practices. There are a lot of places on the planet today in westernized societies where psychologists are recognizing this and trying to recover the way hunting and gathering folk raised their kids. And that set our DNA on its frequency, according to anthropologists today. There's some anthropologists who would talk about the rule of 150 and say that basically so far in our time on the planet, our experience is that of a mammal that does well in groups of 150 people or less. When we grow into settlements that are larger than that, we get beyond our capacity to process information well in relationships. Anthropologists will do studies of Facebook today, and you may have hundreds of names on your Facebook account, but you will deal with any degree of coherence and consistency with about 143 on average. Beyond that, it gets very slippery because we just don't have the time and energy and mental fluidity and range to be able to process complex input beyond that. That's not to say that we'll always be that way, but genetics changes slowly, DNA changes slowly, and we have been set up by our experience on the planet to do well in face-to-face communities that are small. What then happened about 10,000 years ago was we crossed a sort of threshold where for the first time we began to do agriculture. What is agriculture? Agriculture is making a plant do something it otherwise wouldn't do if you leave it wild. In particular, agriculture in most places is a matter of clear-cutting all the plants you don't want to grow. It's a holocaust on plant life for the sake of that one or two that you want to grow, wheat or barley or oats or millet or maize or rice. And you get involved in the sex life of the plant, help it propagate a particular field that you otherwise clear of all competitors, and then you have to tend that field because those competitors will come back in because they want biodiversity, and actually so does the wheat and the corn and plants that you consider to be staples, because that's how they live. And so you have to continually be violently coercive to make those plants do what you want them to do. You domesticate. We domesticated plants, and that's hard work. And so we fairly rapidly also began to domesticate animals to help us in the project of domesticating plants, to do some of the plowing, to cart the fruits after harvest to the village, and so on. And so this project of what I'm calling flexible domestication of plants and animals first began to show up 10,000 years ago, again in the Middle East, as best we understand. Now, archaeology is uncovering information about our deep pasts, all the time, and debate and wrestle with whether we got the timeline right or not. But so far, this is roughly how we evolved. And these communities, you were already getting some settlements, some village settlements, even of hunter-gatherers in southeast Turkey and the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean, doing only hunting and gathering. And then we start to do agriculture and flexible domestication. There's a little bit bigger settlement, maybe towns of 5,000 folk who are doing subsistence agriculture, low-tech agriculture. They're doing pastoralism. Some of the members of the community are tending goats, cows, sheep, pigs, getting meat, getting milk, getting dairy, getting animal hides, and continuing to do hunting and gathering. These communities were multiply skilled at accessing food from very different sources and being able to switch up when they... And for 4,000 years, we lived that way. Not in hierarchies. These communities are starting to become bigger than hunter-gatherer bands, but they're not yet into domination systems where some people are making decisions on behalf of everybody else. It's still basically sustainable and basically just. And then we hit this threshold. And we don't entirely know why the change first started to take place. Probably related to climate change and pressures. But in Mesopotamia, you get the appearance for the first time of city-state systems presided over by ruling elites who are coercing everybody else to labor to grow crop. So it is a new social form based on coerced labor aimed at generating surplus. So the 80 to 90% of the population of these city-state systems, when they first emerge, who are the peasant small farmers, grow crop and then are forced to give up 2/5 to 4/5 of what they grow to the ruling class elites in the name of taxation. Taxation is the name put on the surplus production that is claimed by the elites. Taxation is not a phenomenon of wild nature. How many people in here pay taxes? None of y'all pay taxes? Hands. Why? Why do you pay taxes? For the most part, the people you're paying taxes to are living a much fatter cat lifestyle than you are. Why are you paying them? No, I'm serious. Why?
We don't go to the jail.
Absolutely. Bottom line is because you're coerced. Because the alternative is bodily consequences brought to bear on you physically in the form of jail, in the form of who knows what else. Which is to say, and my work educationally, I sometimes stop as a kind of Marvin Gaye enterprise. What I'm aiming at is what's going on. I want to get us in touch with the basic structure of what is happening as best I can. What to do about it, how to remedy it, if we want to change it, that's a different question and an important one that we need to wrestle with. But first of all, we need to understand what we're already embedded in, what's already happening, what's already going on. What I'm saying a city is, every city, cut to the chase, cut through all the smoke and mirrors, the glitter and PR. What a city is a structure of violent appropriation of carrying capacity from elsewhere, pulled up into the city center, into its infrastructure, its lifestyles, its architecture, and finally the reason it ends up there is because of violence. Because you're threatened with violence otherwise. If you look at this thing as it comes into being historically, why do these people give up 2 to 4/5 of what their labor has pulled out of nature that's useful to human beings? Why do they give that to these folk? And let me that a bit. If everybody consumes everything their labor creates, so I work to pull out some foodstuffs from wild nature, and then my family consumes it all. I sculpt some rock into spear points or into axe heads to help me gather food, and then we use them. If everybody consumes and uses everything their labor pulls out of wild nature that's useful for human beings, is there any surplus? No. Is there any poverty? No. That's how we lived as hunting and gathering folk. I developed this understanding. I think I probably shared this part of it with you the last time we were together. Did I? Anybody remember? Okay, that makes me feel good because then I'm not repeating myself. This kind of thing I developed initially to help me understand the relationship between riches and poverty. What is wealth? What is impoverishment? And what I'm saying in this understanding is that what riches is, what wealth is, what surplus is, what a hoard of stuff is somebody's labor who pulled that into being who did not themselves enjoy it. That's what wealth is. It doesn't fall out of the sky. It doesn't grow on trees. It is the result of labor. And if the people who are doing the labor themselves consume and use and enjoy everything their labor created, and there ain't no wealth. There ain't no poverty either. And what I'm saying at the most basic level is these are correlates of each other. You don't get wealth, you don't get surplus hordes of products unless you've got people who did the labor who did not themselves enjoy it, which is what I'm calling poverty or impoverishment. And then there's the political aspect, who has decision-making power over that hoard of surplus and who doesn't. The economics and the politics. And again, when I'm saying a city, these city-states as they came into being were monocropping, The elites were deciding what crop to grow and basically coercing most of the population to be involved growing it and to give up a certain percentage, 2 to 4/5 of what their labor produced, claimed as taxation by the elites and imposed on these folk. They would also conscript these people to build buildings and roads and to be part of armies, do irrigation of the 2 rivers once they began to decimate, clear cut all the forests around the Tigris and Euphrates. Present-day Iraq is now a desert, didn't used to be that. Before this got going, it was a cedar forest. But these things cut down all the forests and then rearranged the river system so that it began to silt up and salinate, and they had to develop irrigation and so on. Building walls. You also get these other 2 things, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So, what I'm trying to demarcate here is a shift from a basic economy that is gift economy reciprocity, where you get the goods and you circulate them. Everybody has access roughly to the same amount of goods. In most hunting and gathering societies, if you go out and hunt and kill big game, you as hunter don't get to enjoy the meat. You take it back and you distribute it to everybody else. How do you survive? Well, you survive because everybody else is doing the same thing. And when they kill game, they're bringing it back, manipulating it to you. It's a gift economy understanding where the ritual processes and the social processes and the shaping of emotion is all geared towards not letting anybody get control of a surplus. The understanding is your family, your community, you circulate what you get access to. And even when we go to flexible domestication, that's basically still a lot of the operative understanding. When we cross this threshold, the impetus is more and more on surplus accumulation and coercion, as I'm talking about, where a city-state is amassing resources, so-called goods from wild nature, stockpiled in the city, enjoyed overwhelmingly by the elites at the expense of everybody else. So the next question is, why do these people put up with it? Do the peasants ever revolt? Yes. What typically happens to them? Here he's going. Well, by whom? Because they vastly outnumber these folk. You know, this is 80 to 90% of this given society. These folk are like 1 to 3%. And then they've got a little retainer class that helps them do what they do. They vastly outnumber these folk. So how come they typically get crushed? Well, because what these city-state systems do is the elite ruling classes will use some of this surplus product to recruit some of these folk to become a standing army charged with maintaining this social structure. And the revolting peasants with pitchforks and rocks will be face to face with a standing army that is outfitted with state-of-the-art weaponry, whatever it is at that point in history. Might be crossbows, might be swords, might be chariots, and military discipline, whatever qualifies as military discipline. So that even though the peasants vastly outnumber the standing army, they'll typically get crushed. If they do succeed, and once in a while they did, what they typically did is just reproduce this structure with a few of the peasants now becoming the new elites, because they didn't have vision of any other way to live. Right? So that, I'm saying, is the basic thing, the domination structure that reorients our way of being on the planet, that has now swept over the planet, become ever larger in industrialization, began to domesticate not just plants and animals, but minerals, and fossil fuels, and now with digitalization and private human experience, it's gone hyper, but it's this same social formation and understanding, basically. It's worth saying that some of these folk not only revolted, but exited, particularly those who were involved in animal husbandry. This economy, this state monocrop agricultural economy, is a two-winged economy. Most folk are growing crops, some folk are herding animals, taking the animals out daily to the fields, pulling them back in, or maybe seasonally, maybe going out for a whole summertime and coming back in. And then they with each other, dairy and hide and meat and wood and rock for textiles and crop, grain, ceramics, and so on. But they basically are all part of the same formation. But these animal husbandry folk began at one point to say, in effect, F you. We're going out with our herds, and we're not coming back. And we'll be just fine, thank you, because our herds will integrate us into the semi-arid grasslands that are not occupied and surveilled by the city-states, and we will be integrated into those ecosystems by the animals. We'll live off the animals, we'll just be a member of the herd, and it will work just fine. Pastoral nomadism, exiting city-state systems, is the first resistance movement we engaged in as a species when we went heavy-handed and top-down in this new way of organizing human life. And this is where the biblical tradition begins, because the biblical tradition is part of this broader pastoral nomad resistance phenomenon that took place in the Mideast, it took place in Asia, it took place in Africa, where folk could go out and not come back. Charlie, you want to?
Jim, do you want to entertain questions from the viewers now, or wait till Q&A?
Yeah, I'd rather get most of this out, and then let's have at it. Okay. Pastoral nomads mobile in unruled space. Okay. So that's the basic phenomenon that gets rolling. Although there's another element of it that I haven't talked about yet that I want to throw in, and then we can maybe entertain a question or two, and then I'll adapt it to our present time, whether we can use this to think about where we are today. It's inefficient for standing armies to be out in the fields alongside peasant small farmers, holding a sword at their throat while they tend to the crops. So what every one of these state systems also does with some of this surplus product is recruit some people to become scribes to begin doing writing. You only get writing in history in any concerted practice when you get city-state systems. What did writing come into being to do? Why did we write? Why did we start writing? What was that all about?
Expanding?
Not expanding. Eddie? Of taxes. Who still owes what to the elites? Keeping tax records, bookkeeping, accounting. That's what writing first came into being to do for these city-state systems. Fairly quickly after that, it developed a second prong, if you want, of beginning to articulate the worldview, the theology, philosophy, ideology, I don't care what word we use for it, the explanatory system for who's who and why. Why do some people get to live well at the expense of other people? And I forgot to actually lay that out. Who's living well here and who's not living so well? Sorry, I'm having to go back on this explanation for a second. How are these folk living compared to these folk on average? Are they living ostentatious, luxurious lifestyles, outgrowing crops? And the ruling classes are living poor, bare board, bread and water diets? Or is it the other way around? Yeah, you're looking at me like, what are you talking about? How much surplus did the ruling elites want to commandeer from the peasant small farmers? How much did they want to take? Yeah, they don't want to take all of it, because if they take all of it, then these folk will die. They'll starve to death. And then who's going to grow the crops? Who's going to do the work? Who's going to do the menial labor? The ruling elites want these folk there, not just today, but tomorrow, next Saturday, next month, next year, to continue to do the work, to grow the crops, to supply the surplus that they live off of. What their strategy is to take everything they can above and beyond subsistence, leaving just enough for these folk to be able to work strenuously and to reproduce. The name of the game, if you're a peasant small farmer, is to try to hold back a little bit above and beyond the subsistence level as a kind of insurance policy, a hedge against an accident, an illness, a bad crop year, and frankly, to party with. And that defines the typical relations of struggle between these different groups. Peasant small farmers trying to retain a bit more, ruling elites trying to get everything they can above and beyond subsistence. What I was saying about scribes and writing, doing bookkeeping in the middle of all of that, and then beginning to elaborate the idea system that explains why these folk get to live fat cat lifestyles while everybody else has to live subsistence. Why is that? And typically, what those explanatory systems did was grafted whatever that society considered to be ultimate authority into the explanation as the final warrant for why that social order lives the way it lives and does what it does. So they would say, basically, in effect, the reason things are like this is because God wills it, Allah wills it, Krishna wills it, etc. They would put in, typically it was a god or a goddess, into the explanatory system, and in so many words say, this thing is the way it is because God wills it to be that way. And your duty is to supply surplus for these folk. You'll get your reward in the by and by. Right? That is to say, the scribes are producing the sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, the Pali Canon, etc., that enshrines the explanatory system, that grafts ultimate sacred reality, the ultimate authority of the universe, into the explanation as the backer of the social system. But most people can't read in these societies. So where are the sacred texts produced by the scribes promulgated for the average person? In churches, mosques, shrines, temples, whatever in that society is designated as a gathering place and social pressure brought to bear on everybody to show up there on a regular basis. In effect, to be indoctrinated with the explanatory system. So that you get, in effect, the equivalent of a standing army up inside the heads of everybody, and you don't have to hold a sword at their throat because they'll police themselves. in the name of not rebelling against divinity, not rebelling against God. Everybody with me so far? Roughly. I'm just trying to get at the basic structure here. So what this is saying is that for the last 5,000 years, the ideas that are promulgated are ideas that are designed to do what? To make clear what is going on, or to mask what is going on? Are the ideas that the scribes are writing and enshrining as sacred going to say clearly what's going on here is these people are living off the rest of you? Are the ideas going to say that? I'm sorry? Yeah. They're not going to say that. They're going to say anything but that. All right? It is, as you say, masking this, which means for 5,000 years, most of the ideas that have been abroad in most societies organized like this have not been about clarity, but making it difficult to actually see what's going on. Now, can somebody here figure out what's going on? Say, I don't buy that God's will is that I labor day in, day out, live on a meager diet of whatever staple I'm growing, whatever carbohydrate grain it is, burying family members early because they don't have good diets either, and many of them don't make it. While I can see other folk who are living much higher on the hog and flourishing, I don't buy that that is God's will for me. No, F that. Can somebody think that and say, you know, what's really going on here is these folk are living off the rest of us, using God as a godfather that they manipulate? Can somebody think that in this kind of society? Yeah. What can they do with that thought? Well, they could communicate it to family members when they go back from the field to the peasant village at night. What's the likely response from family members going to be? Yeah, probably that's a dangerous thought. Jack, do not say that to anybody else. You'll put the whole family at risk. Or maybe the family will say, you know, you're right. Yeah, I'm tired of this too. Thank you for saying that. Who else could they communicate with? Well, maybe to a few other folk out in the field they encounter as they're laboring, but it's not going to be many. If they really want to broadcast their idea to get it circulating throughout the community, what they're going to have to do is go up into the place of gathering and promulgate it there. And what will happen to them if they do? Because whose place is this? Place, the ruling elites, the scribes who teach the scriptures, the priests that I don't have up there, who enact what the scribes are writing liturgically and dramaturgically so that it can be consumed orally, it can be internalized orally. And you would have to take your critical ideas on what's going on up here, preach them, teach them over time to get them broadly disseminated. And probably what's going to happen to you as soon as you open your mouth is you're going to be shut down, you're going to be killed, you're going to be exiled, you're going to be jailed. Which is to say that in this model, the ideas that are around, that are up inside everybody's head and looking out through their eyeballs before they even know they're a person, are the ideas of those who have control of the surplus and can then control the media. All right? That's the basic model that I want to get at. We need to pull it up to the time that we are in, but I think right now I want to take questions for a few minutes that anybody might have.
There are two from the internet.
Okay.
They're related.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is okay. The two questions from the internet are related. One is referencing, excuse me, something got in the way. Garrett Hardin in Tragedy of the Commons. They're asking whether taxation can benefit the commons.
Good question.
And the other question that seems to be related is that, is it inevitable that the wealth impoverishes the poor?
Okay. Both good questions. What I would say about the second one for a moment is we could have conversation about that for a long, long time and do wide reading. And of course, there would be disputation on all sides. We live in a society that is utterly committed to the idea that wealth is moral and is the way to be a human being. So what I'm saying is going to be resisted deeply by almost everybody in our society at some level, unconsciously, if not consciously, because we've been socialized to believe that wealth is a mark of robust, vital human being. Our whole social order is oriented to that. The last 500 years of settler history have been predicated on that. And the roots of settler colonial society back in Europe are even older, and indeed I'm saying it goes back 5,000 years. The ideas begin to be promulgated that this is the stellar exemplar way to be. These are the folk who are closest to God. In fact, they name themselves in many of these city-state systems as the sons and daughters of the gods and goddesses, but really they understand themselves to be the gods and goddesses, divvying out life, deciding life for everybody else. I still would argue that you can't get surplus except through labor. And if you've got a hoard of surplus that you didn't labor into being, where did it come from? Somebody labored it that doesn't now have it. Why don't they have it? Why do you have it and not them? Okay. The question about the tragedy of the commons, I can't remember the name of a book that was studying pastoral nomadism today in various places across the globe and countering some of Harding's argument, saying that among pastoral nomads sharing steppe land, sharing water resources, where you would expect tragedy of the commons logic to actually lock them into competition and ultimately into war and one side devastating the other, hasn't happened in a lot of places because they have agreements. They have these kinds of agreements where they recognize each other's need to have access to the resources. And so I do think tragedy of the commons logic works in a lot of places in this kind of society, but it's mitigated and even disempowered where folk can come to agreement about the commons and how it's going to be shared. And I would say that I think that the history of the commons, even inside this, is part of what we need to get conversant. Because that's really where settler colonialism begins, back in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries in Europe, with the beginning of the closing of the commons, so that peasants in Europe were unable to go outside their croplands to the woods to hunt, fish, and graze whatever animals they had. The elites, after a certain point, began to close down, just to take over those common areas, wall them off, so that peasants became more and more reduced to just their physical body, which is how they get moved from peasantry into proletarianism, to capitalism in its urban form, where you go to the market and all you have to offer, you don't even own the tools of production. You only have your own body, your brain and your brawn, and that's it. That's all you bring to the table to negotiate with the capitalist who owns everything else. That happened over centuries in pushing peasants away from the commons. Prior to that time, many of those communities had understandings about how to use the commons commonly. So up inside here, a memory of this kind of reciprocity operating. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm a religious, and because of that, when I was having to do something about taxes, I don't pay taxes. The congregation pays what the sisters, need to contribute to the country, I guess. But the other thing about it is, in your diagram, there was always somebody like St. Benedict who went off into the hills with other people that wanted to live a different kind of life and get out of this trap. How does that fit into the general picture that you're painting? Or is it just a weird thing where sometimes we try to go back to being hunter-gatherers and, flexible domestication and so forth, but it always falls down because the Benedictines always get rich and, then they screw up too. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah. What I'm presenting is simple. I'm just trying to lay out a basic structure, obviously. But I would insist and do in my teaching and in my conversation with people on, looking at the complexity in relationship to this constant question about what's really going on. I think you can analyze monasticism in relationship to this. You can say early Christianity was basically an attempt to exit the city-state system. The Jesus movement in Galilee was all about organizing peasant small farmers to recover the Sabbath Jubilee tradition, which we'll probably talk about the third week a little bit, recovering a more sustainable relationship with the land as well as a more just relationship with each other, circulating the gifts that they enjoyed from the land. Certainly the early church in Acts 2 and Acts 4, sharing all things in common. That's exactly what this is. Roman Empire becomes Christianized after Constantine in 312, Christianity becomes the vehicle of imperialism. From that point forward, desert monasticism, desert fathers and mothers, going out, away, not so much being pastoral nomads, although some of them had herds of goats in the desert, but figuring out how to live on the land. Of course, doing that for the most part as celibates, so they had a little trouble reproducing themselves, except by conversion of other folk that they pulled out of the city-state system. But yeah, you can do that kind of analysis. And there's history of that all the way along, people exiting as pastoral nomads, levelers up here in 16th, 17th century England, who are called levelers precisely because what they're doing is cutting down the hedges that had been grown up by the elites to enclose the commons. They're retrieving the commons, and they become known for that. But they're basically farming folk. They're still dependent on terrain that is also claimed by the city-state system. To really exit this, you have to know you can eat not dependent on it. Otherwise, your critique is not going to go very far. Pastoral nomads are able to exit it and not go back. But today, with drone technology and globalization and the efflorescence of states taking over land from all the remaining hunting and gathering groups, so there's only a few of them left and they're at risk, and pushing on pastoral nomad groups that regularly cross borders in places where they exist, it's becoming increasingly the case there is no outside to this. And then the question becomes, how do we open up inside of it some of this older memory of how to live otherwise, to live some of these values up inside this thing, knowing it's going to be beleaguered, knowing it's going to be compromised, knowing if we do it well, it probably will be shut down violently, but it may seed history with memory and example and hope that will sprout in another time with some other people, which is how I would understand what it means to be a human being anyway. That all of us are doing that all the time, at best. So did you want to ask some more?
Is there any other question?
Yeah, okay, so go on. So let's adapt this now quickly in the time we have left to today. Is that all right? Did somebody have a question? Next week? Tommy, you can go sit behind her if you want to be close to her, but we're doing our own little two-step here. And she'll be doing a little bit heavier hitting next week and in the weeks that follow.
More question.
I guess what keeps eating at me, I'm reading this book written by this, I think it's Potawatomi botanist called Braiding Sweetgrass.
Yeah.
And it talks about the very things that you're
Yep.
telling us, and living close with nature, knowing it so intimately because you're so dependent on it, but also you preserve it because you know you need it. So I keep asking, I don't think it's ever possible to go back to that, but my question is, when I look at your line, I can't wrap my head around the question why we would leave that type of system, which makes so much sense to me that, because you're so intimately involved with nature, you are compelled to preserve it. The salmon, the sweetgrass, the ducks, the wild rice, you make sure you leave something for the other animals I just can't understand why.
Yeah, pull it down. Or pull it up.
I believe on their own they wouldn't typically leave, right? From the experience of indigenous peoples, they are either, once they're taken off the land and their means of subsistence undermined, then they have no choice. So Stanley Diamond, this anthropologist, says that they are conscripts of civilization, not volunteers.
Yeah. Scott will talk about the fact that in Mesopotamia, none of the folk who were hunting and gathering folk, or even members of these flexible domestication communities, voluntarily entered these city-states. And the big problem these city-states had, the primary problem they had, was keeping their labor force, because people constantly run away. And they'd have to plunder other city-state systems, and the primary thing they were grabbing up were laboring bodies to become, in effect, slaves. I mean, what I'm talking about domestication as actually a form of enslavement. That's really what we're talking about. We can use different words for it, but when you begin to coerce something to do something you want it to do against its own will, that. And there are different forms of enslavement, and the most ruthless, vicious, and concerted form, I would argue, is what we witnessed in the Atlantic slave trade and everything that came after it. But that doesn't mean isn't slavery all the way through this thing. I would say this is a regime of enslavement. And people were constantly fleeing, and but the problem is, if they have been de-skilled, then what? Because they can flee, but then they're going to die because they don't have the skills to access food out in the environments where they might find themselves. And you can't learn those kinds of skills overnight. And indeed, that was part of the colonial enterprise. We'll talk about that in the next couple of weeks, too. Around global south now nations, part of the colonial project was to de-skill people. Get one generation into it, and then the game is over. Because you have a captive labor force. Doesn't know how to do anything else, even if it wanted to. And to some extent, that's true of us. The one other thing I wanted to say, in my book, the latest book that a lot of this comes out of, or that, it comes out of all of us, but both of us. One chapter on Kimmerer, a huge section on Kimmerer, because he was a very powerful teacher for me. The book that our sister there is referencing, Breeding Sweetgrass, which I'd recommend everybody. Potawatomi woman in New York, writing about some of this stuff. The other thing I would say is that we often hear, oh, this is fine, but you can't go back. We can't go back. We spit that phrase out like that's a gospel truth. Yeah, you can. People have gone back throughout history. You're out in the woods and you go walking and you get lost. What do? You keep going the direction you're going? Or do you go back and pick up, try to find where you lost the trail, where you lost your way? There isn't anything in the universe that says you can't go back. Now, is it hard to go back? Is there so much happened it's very tough to go back? Yeah. But what I would say, and what a whole lot of people are saying, is what we need to do is slow down, stop, and listen. And learn some of what these folk knew about how to live in place justly. And then see if we can splice it into where we are now to create a third thing that is not this and not simply this, but a new modality of being. But we got to learn the alternative to this, not just sort of invent it out of our heads. It's right there in most of our history. In this timeline, to be to scale, it would have to go all the way out and wrap around Detroit. It's overwhelmingly most of our history.
I think it's probably time to quit unless we have more questions.
We still have, I'm going by the clock up there, it's still...
I can't hear anybody.
I'm going by the clock up there, is that not right?
It's 1:45.
Yeah.
So, is there more conversation?
Well, I have more that I need to do here.
That's
what I'm saying.
Fine.
There's a whole
Carry
piece
on.
of this that...
Sorry.
They've already had it, so... Okay. So what I now want to do is quickly run this through where we are today. Can you use, this is just a little paradigm to think with. It's not gospel truth. It's something I devised to help me try to see into complex reality. can you use that to look at where we are? And I'm going to run through this real quickly because we're up against time here. What I would say is yes, but it has to be adapted. One of the things we have to recognize is that today, if you're going to talk about we're now in a globalized economy, and the goods that we have access to are coming from all over the planet. When I do this in classes, I promise students an automatic A if they can identify where the shirt that's on their back came from. And of course, none of them can. You know, you'd have to go all over the globe. But what about the computer? The computer has thousands of parts in it. It's coming from virtually every place you can imagine on the planet. It's all being pulled up, circulated, but it ends up concentrated in particular places. So if you're going to use this paradigm to analyze, you have to remember you have to look at now an entire globalized circulation and rearrangement and violent appropriation of goods. Second, we are in the United States, in a country that prides itself on having separated church and state, supposedly. Now, we're going to talk about the doctrine of Christian discovery next time, in which, at the level of land under our feet and property, it is absolutely not true that we separated church and state. The only reason any of us have property title to land is because of the history of Christianity claiming rights to all the land that anybody else may have occupied or dwelt on for thousands of years. Christianity is written into the very substance of our property law claims. It's the only reason any of us have title. And it's fiction, it's fictitious. We'll talk about that next time. But we have, in other ways, separated church and state. So how does this work, this ideology of the sacred, as I'm calling it, this explanatory system, work here? Well, I called it sacred, and what I would say is it still works. You just have to ask, what is it that any given society values as the ultimate authority, the ultimately sacred values of that society? And what would you say that is for the United States? Money. Well, I would say that is, in fact, we'll do it this way real quickly. So, again, I'm saying elites are commandeering everybody else to do work for them. One of the things they do is conscript them. So, you're George Bush in 2003 in relationship to Iraq, and you want people to go over and invade Iraq, or you're Barack Obama. This cuts either way, Democrats or Republicans. And you want to make sure troops stay in Afghanistan. For either of those, oil, control of oil in the case of Iraq, rare earth minerals in the case of Afghanistan. It's economic, almost always economic. We want goods. We want somebody else's stuff, right? George Bush's daughters don't get sent on the front line. Barack Obama's daughters don't get sent on the front line. The problem for the ruling elites is how to get other people's sons and daughters to go risk their lives for this structure that overwhelmingly benefits them at the expense of everybody else. How do you do that? So let's just take George Bush in 2003. I'm saying you can do this equally with Barack Obama in relationship to Afghanistan or any of the other places we had bases during his regime, which is about 150 countries. What is the headline you put out in the Wall Street Journal? Is it, we need to go into Iraq because we want more money? No, you're not going to get people to mobilize around that. What is the headline? And you're not going to say, we need to go into Iraq because God told me so. And George Bush might say that in certain evangelical permeates, but that's not going to be the promulgated public idea. What it will be is, I would suggest, it will invoke what we consider in our social order to be sacred. Which is what? What are the words that get at that? Security is the negative statement. What do we want to be secure? What's the positive thing that we value so much? Independence is one way of saying it. I would say freedom. And the other word I would say is democracy. That these are the sacred values for our society. If you can convince these folk that these are at risk, they will go kill or be killed. Whether they're at risk is a different question. But if you can get them convinced they're at risk, they'll go. Okay, so I would say you can use this with that nuance to analyze how this works in a place like the United States. Now, to finish this up, the situation today, roughly on a global scale, a globalized economy, is about a sixth of us live like I imagine most of us do, full-bellied, got multiple changes of clothes in the closet at home, can go home to an environment we have some control over in terms of temperature, in terms of who comes and goes. We have some prospect of that continuing for the future. For 4/6, roughly, of the world's population, and these figures are estimates. It fluctuates depending on what's happening with war and marketplaces and so on. But roughly 4/6 of the global population is maybe at the poverty line, maybe a cut above the official UN poverty line, which itself is really not a very strong indicator of poverty because there are all kinds of things it assumes that are not the case. But they are one job loss, one missed paycheck, one illness, one accident away from falling into what the other roughly 1/6 are experiencing, which is they're perishing as we talk. They don't have access to clean drinking water. They don't have access to good nutrition. They don't have access to health care. They don't have job prospects. They are struggling and dying as we talk. And anymore, these are all interrelated. They live the way they do because we live the way we do in a global order. If you have a pie that is limited and some people claim more, what's left for everybody else? Less. Some economists would say, well, but we can intervene technologically to make the planet virtually infinite in the goods it yields. No, not really. No. We can do some things technologically, but fundamentally the planet is limited. There's only so much arable land. There's only so much fresh water. There's only so much breathable air. There's only so much fossil fuel. And in that limited pie, if some folk claim more, there's less for others, which is what is happening here. So the final thing about this is to say, okay, the structure of this today for us in the United States is we are roughly 5%, now it's about 4%, of the global population. We're consuming somewhere between 25 and 40% of global resources, as well as putting out. We'll work with the conservative number, 25%. What is our just percentage of the global pie? The pie is limited, and we're 5% of the world's population. What's our just take? 5%, roughly. If we're taking 25%, how much of what we're taking is not ours? 4/5. Okay. How do those 4/5 of the world's goods get here? Is it the case that others get out of bed in the morning, stretch and yawn and go, oh my God, those folk up in the United States are such champions of democracy, such bastion of freedom. They're more worthy of our goods than we are. We'll give our goods to them. Here you go, 4/5 of our goods. Is that how they get here? No. It's also the case that we have something like 800 military bases, actually more than 1,000 bases and base-like installations in more than 150 countries around the world. How many countries have bases here? 0. Does that asymmetry of militarized presence, coercive force, have anything to do with this asymmetry of enjoyment of goods? Absolutely. That's how it happens. Congressional Research Council of 2010 did a study and said we have invaded sovereign space on the planet 553 times in the official history of the country. That's a little bit less than once every 6. That's business as usual. That's what the country's built on. We plunder. Always have. All the way through the history. Final thing here is, how is it that we are made to feel good about consuming 25% of the world's goods? I would suggest our ideology of the sacred is promulgated to say to us, we're good-hearted people. The American middle-class lifestyle is the premier way to be human on the planet. The American dream, we wish everybody could live it. We're not stingy. We want everybody to be able to live that way. In fact, we'll help you live like we do. That's the idea I suggest that we are given to help us feel good about doing this. Let's say we took that seriously and we got involved in, said, we're going to help everybody else live like we do. And we organize and go first to South America or to Asia and get 5% of the population there living like we do, consuming 25% of the world's resources. And we get excited about that because now we've got some more folk living like we do. And that feels good to us. So we go to South America and get 5% of the population there consuming 25% of the goods. And we're really getting geeked. So we go to Africa and 5% of the population there consuming 25% of the earth's goods. What's left for everybody else? For the other 80% of the world's population at that point? Absolutely nothing. It is patently impossible for a globe of 7.7 billion people to live the middle-class American lifestyle. There's not enough resources to go around. It would take 3 to 5 more Earths devoid of people, all the resources brought here, made available to everybody else, for that to happen. It's delirium. It's what we are sold to make us okay with the violent appropriation and consumption of an unjust share of resources. So that is the basic thing that I think we are involved in, the basic frame that we'll be operating with as we go through the next weeks, get into the doctrine of discovery in some detail. Dr. Mendoza will be talking about her experience and understanding and her analysis. I'll be throwing in some biblical stuff at some point along the way, etc. So thank you for putting up with the big thing.